you stay a little while. This symposium was started by Phil Sherman, a Baltimore Sherlockian, some 43 years ago. It is sponsored by 3 Baker Street Irregular Science Societies, the 6 Napoleons of Baltimore, the SOBs of Baltimore, that's the Sherlockians of Baltimore, and then Watson's Tin Box of Ellicott City. And so these 3 societies come together each year to sponsor this organization. Now, I thought that since this is the 43rd conference held in the Pratt, that I would share with you some of the interesting things about 43. Now, I'm sure some of you are thinking, a number? Interesting? What kind of talk did I come into? Well, the United States flag had 43 stars on it from July 4th, 1890 to July 4th, 1891. I didn't know that. Oban 14, the Scotch whiskey, is 86 proof, which is 43% alcohol. That's useful to know. The poem Beowulf has 43 verses in it. 43 is a prime number. It can only be divided by 1 in itself. 43 is also part of a prime twin, a pair of primes. 41's a prime, 43 is a prime, and that's called a prime twin. 7's a prime, and 5's a prime. That's a prime twin. 11's a prime, 13's a prime. That's another prime twin. We do not have a formula for generating prime twins, but we know that whenever you find a prime twin, there is at least one more prime twin larger than it, which is one way of saying there are an infinite number of prime twins. Now, at this point, you may be saying, okay, 43 is interesting. I didn't expect that, but surely not every number is interesting. Well, in fact, I remember the day in grad school, Mr. Morris, would you please prove to the class that there are no uninteresting numbers? And for a moment, I froze, and then I said, oh, well, let's assume the contrary. Let's assume that there are indeed uninteresting numbers. So that means all of the integers can be divided into 2 disjoint sets, those that are interesting and those that are uninteresting. Now, look at the set of uninteresting numbers. Among them, there is the smallest uninteresting number. And in fact, it's interesting that it is the smallest uninteresting number. Therefore, it's incorrectly placed in the set. You have to put it in the set of interesting numbers, but that contradicts the original assumption. Therefore, there are no uninteresting numbers. QED. All right. That's I wanted to make sure that we got this symposium off on the right foot. Our first speaker today is Dan Andriacco. He rather likes the idea that he's the first one because all of the tension of preparing, did I get the comma right? Did I get this? That's going to be behind him in just a few seconds. He's going to give the talk. It's over and done with. Dan is a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. He is St. Saviour's near King's Cross. He is a mystery writer, a pasticheur. I've not ever seen that noun before, but I know immediately what a pasticheur is. An essayist. His primary detective series, beginning with the novel No Police Like Holmes, features Sherlockian sleuth Sebastian McCabe and his faithful narrator, Jeff Cody. If you haven't read Dan's books, they're really delightful. I suggest you just Google Dan Andriacco. They're delightful books. Dan has also written 2 novel-length Sherlockian pastiches and a score of monographs. He is the most scandalous member of the Tankerville Club of Cincinnati, Scion, and top knot of his last bow, Scion, for Sherlockians and bow ties. He bought the first copy of the complete Sherlock Holmes with his own money at the age of 12. And so Dan Andriacco is going to be speaking on Montague Street, a curious place and a not so mean street.
Thank you, Brent. I think the most interesting numbers are 221 and 1895. Okay. The opening scene of the Musgrave Ritual finds Mr. Sherlock Holmes in a nostalgic and revelatory mood one winter's night, sitting by the fire, as he tells Dr. Watson, "When I first came up to London, I had rooms in Montague Street, just around the corner from the British Museum, and there I waited, filling my all too abundant leisure time by studying all those branches of science which might make me more efficient. Now and again, cases came my way, principally through the introduction of old fellow students. For during my last years of the university, there was a good deal of talk there about myself and my methods." Now, the obvious inference here is that Holmes is informing his flatmate about the Montague Street digs for the first time. Therefore, that is not where he was living when the two met and agreed to go halves on 221B. There are a number of interesting questions related to Holmes's Montague Street period and thereafter. For instance, what were the first two professional cases he handled at Montague Street before Roger Musgrave came to call? Why were they among those matters he described to Watson on that winter day as not all successes? Where was Holmes hanging his long gray traveling cloak and close-fitting cloth cap in the days immediately before Baker Street? Why and when did he leave Montague Street to go there? And what made Holmes wish to move yet again to at least his third set of London rooms just before he first encountered Watson? Any answers to those questions would be sheer speculation. Unlike some Sherlockians, we shall not speculate. That might be an effable twaddle. As Holmes himself said, this agency stands flat-footed upon the ground, and there it must remain. Fortunately, however, there is much we can say with confidence about the geography, the history, and the canonical connections of Montague Street, nearby Montague Place, and the famous neighborhood of which they are a part. Quote, "Bedford House, a family seat of the Russell family, was demolished in 1800, and Montague Street was formed on the gardens of the mansion between 1803 and 1805, according to William H. Gill in his 1960 Sherlock Holmes Journal essay on some notable Sherlockian buildings. Gill said, Montague Street was not quite so fashionable as Baker Street, but the logical and unadorned houses might have appealed to Holmes's austere mind. You can see Montague Street on this map from page 221 of Jack Tracy's invaluable Sherlock Holmes Encyclopedia Sherlockiana, and also on a newer Sherlockian map. The street runs in a north-south direction between Russell Square on the north and Great Russell Street on the south. The British Museum is on the west side of the street, fronting on Great Russell Street. There is also a museum entrance on Montague Street. I'm told that today it is much the same as it was 130 years ago. And here is a visit. Whoops. Here's a photo from a visit there this past May. David L. Hammer, in his 1983 book, The Game is Afoot, provides an excellent description that is worth noting. I think I'm a little bit off here. Hold on a second. Yeah. The Montague Street houses are row structures, part of a ducal development of the Georgian period. They are identical in height, 4 stories plus a basement. The entrances are all on the right with fan lights above and 2 windows on the ground floor. The 3 floors above each have 3 windows across, and the windows on the upper 2 floors much smaller than on the first floor. The latter windows extend from the floor to the ceiling and front on a low iron balcony extending along the front of the house. The top 3, this is not in my control. An enemy has done this. Oh, okay. Should I just let you guys do it? Or, okay. At any rate, the top 3 floors are of old dark brick, with the ground floor being of white stone. Iron railings surround the light wells for the basement windows. The only individual variations are the curtains and the different colored doors, with the general impression being one of neatness and comfortable respectability. These houses are of the same type as existed in Baker Street of Holmes's day, and indeed are found throughout London in various stages of care and disrepair. Today, those buildings on Montague Street are all hotels. But which of them was the address for which Holmes first plied his unique trade, the Proto 221B? In the early 1970s, Michael Harrison, the well-known British Holmesian, established from old volumes of the London Post Office Directory that a Mrs. Holmes rented 26 Montague Street on a 7-year lease, beginning with the Michaelmas, that's September 29th of 1877. Neither tax records nor records of the Duchy of Bedford Estate, which owned the freehold, yielded any further information about Mrs. Holmes. But we would be dull indeed if we did not strongly suspect that she had 2 sons, one of whom lived with her as he tested his ability to make his own way in the world. That would mean that before there was Mrs. Hudson, there was another Mrs. H, tested by his strange hours and even stranger visitors. The first slide showing the British Museum. In his Montague Street days, Sherlock Holmes must have spent much time nearby in the British Museum, where Mr. Henry Baker and Karl Marx both whiled away their days during their respective eras. The museum, an international treasure mentioned 5 times in the canon, was founded on the mammoth collection of Sir Hans Sloane. You may recall the unfortunate Nathan Garrideb in the eponymous story bragging, "I shall be the Hans Sloane of my age." The original Hans was an Anglo-Irish physician and naturalist from Ulster who died in 1753. He willed his collection of curiosities, about 71,000 objects, that's almost as much as Peter Blau has, to be sold to King George for the nation at a price of £20,000, said to be £30,000 less than their value. The first home of the museum on the same Great Russell Street site as the present one was a late 17th century mansion called Montague House. A new building was erected on this site between 1823 and 1852 and added to many times since. Sherlock Holmes's visits to the British Museum did not end when he left Montague Street. He investigated Stapleton's reputation there and the Hound of the Baskervilles, and read up on voodooism there in Wisteria Lodge. Although he neglected to mention it in the Red-Headed League, it is likely that Holmes also visited the nearby pub on occasion, though perhaps not as often as Mr. Henry Baker. Although Watson called it the Alpha Inn, it has long been thought to be the Museum Tavern. The Museum Tavern. Christopher Morley, in his famous introduction to the Baker Street Irregulars publication of The Blue Carbuncle, placed the Alpha at the corner of Museum and Great Russell Streets, the location of the Museum Tavern. You will still find it there today, where I made an on-site investigation in May. Sadly, I did not get inside. Other writers have argued that another pub in the neighborhood, The Plough, at Museum and Little Russell Streets, was the original of the Alpha. But John L. Lillenberg, in a 1994 article on the early Holmes, Alone in Bloomsbury, argues strongly for the Museum Tavern. That is a later slide. Go back, please. Back till we get to, there is a slide showing the British Museum. There we go. And then there's the one, and then after the British Museum, there should be one that shows the Museum Tavern. The outside, there we go. Other writers have argued that another pub in the neighborhood, The Plough at Museum and Little Russell Streets, was the original of the Alpha. But John L. Lillenberg, in a 1994 article on the early Holmes, Alone in Bloomsbury, argues strongly for the Museum Tavern. After pointing out that the Bloomsbury neighborhood has long been dominated by 2 institutions, the British Museum and the University of London, he wrote, "Ever since it was built in 1855, the Museum Tavern has been another long-standing institution in the neighborhood, and its name bespeaks its social association with the denizens of the great national resource just across Great Russell Street. So the Museum Tavern was a highly suitable pub for that somewhat tatterdemalion scholar, Henry Baker. Henry Baker was a man who prided himself on his intellectual life, socially as well as professionally, and it is difficult to imagine him walking past the Museum Tavern down to the shabbier and less intellectual Plough. So there you have it. The Museum Tavern is the Alpha Inn. In the fall of, let's see, we should be able to go on from here. Next slide, please. In the fall 1991 issue of the Serpentine Muse, Robert N. Brodie makes the clever and by no means far-fetched speculation that Sherlock Holmes may have continued to use his original Montague Street lodgings or another nearby as one of the 5 small refuges in different parts of London in which he was able to change his personality, as mentioned by Watson in Black Peter. Brodie writes, when he moved, he might not have kept the lease on those rooms. Might he not have kept the lease on those rooms in anticipation that one day he would need another address? Undoubtedly, the rent at Montague Street was quite low because in those early days, Holmes was not receiving the handsome fees and rewards he was to earn later in his career. Alternatively, he may have taken rooms with Mrs. Warren, whose boarding house we learn in The Red Circle was in Great Orme Street at the northeast side of the British Museum, only a few blocks from Montague Street. If I were your lodger, he tells Mrs. Warren, you would not see me for weeks on end. Suggestive, is it not? Indeed, it is suggestive, although no more than that. Let us leave the field of speculation and return to what we know. We know, for example, that Violet Hunter rode from Montague Place, presumably her home, when she sent Holmes the missive that began his involvement in the highly Gothic adventure of the Copper Beeches. You may recall that message said, Dear Mr. Holmes, I am anxious to consult you whether I should or should not accept the situation which has been offered to me as a governess. I shall call at 10:30 tomorrow if I do not inconvenience you. Yours faithfully, Violet Hunter. So we should be on a slide of Montague Place. Montague Place, just north of the British Museum, was also briefly the residence of another person well known to students of Sherlock Holmes. Catherine Cook and the late Dr. Alvin E. Roden told the tale in the first part of the essay on Arthur Conan Doyle in London in the summer 1993 issue of the Baker Street Miscellanea. They wrote, on or about March 24th, 1891, Conan Doyle and his wife Louisa moved into a rented flat at 23 Montague Place, Bloomsbury, a building about 2/3 of the way along the north side, demolished in 1908 to make way for the approach to the British Museum. The house belonged to Mrs. Mary Esther Gould and was listed in the Post Office London Directory of 1891 as a lodging house. Although the house no longer exists, the next slide should show a view of the British Museum as Conan Doyle might have seen it from Montague Place. There we go. At the same time, the budding writer opened a practice as an ophthalmologist a 15-minute walk away at 2 Upper Wimpole Street while writing the first batch of Sherlock Holmes adventures for the Strand magazine. The practice and the Conan Doyle's Montague Place residence did not last long. As Cook and Roden related, after only 3 months, when Conan Doyle decided to give up medicine for literature, he and his wife left central London once again, moving to the suburb of South Norwood, which is where many of the later Sherlock Holmes adventures were written. Montague Street, Montague Place, and the British Museum are part of the fabled Bloomsbury district, which is our last slide. The group of avant-garde English writers, intellectuals, philosophers, and artists who lived in this area in the 1920s and 1930s became known as the Bloomsbury Group or Bloomsbury Set. They included Virginia Woolf, John Maynard Keynes, E.M. Forster, and Lytton Strachey. Their personal lives were a bit messy. According to a quote attributed to Dorothy Parker, they lived in squares, painted in circles, and loved in triangles. Would Sherlock Holmes, who was described by Watson as having a bohemian soul, feel comfortable in his old stomping grounds if he were to visit Montague Street again in his post-Altamont period? Like the question posed at the beginning of this talk, there can be no real answer, only bold speculation, which we will leave to more adventurous Sherlockians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. I might remind everybody, and I haven't done this myself, please take your phones and put them on stun. It's always a good thing to do in a gathering like this. All right, that will do little damage, but it will slow down the Klingon, so got it on stun. Again, thank you for addressing us, Dan. We've got the pleasure of having two Dans in a row. Dan Thomas is going to will address us next. Every Pratt meeting that I've been to, Dan has been a speaker, and I've been delighted to hear it. He is a trial attorney practicing in Baltimore, in the Baltimore metropolitan area, specializing in complex family law litigation. He was reintroduced to Sherlock Holmes in the 1980s by the beloved Sherlockian Philip Sherman. Remember, it was Phil who started the Pratt series. And Dan served as Gassagene 20 of the 6 Napoleons. In the tradition of Ronald Knox, he plays the grand game and has embarked upon a campaign to instill in followers of the canon the conviction that Sherlock Holmes lived and still lives, tending his bees on the slopes of the Sussex Downs, and refuses to believe Sir Arthur Conan Doyle to have been anything but a literary agent for Dr. Watson. The only thing I must say that confuses me, and it's I keep thinking of this in terms of why there's no interesting numbers. You have a set of numbers that are interesting. Dan, the topic of Dan's talk is 221B Baker Street, the address that never was, and yet he's going to be addressing us. So it's going to be interesting to see the situation where he gives an address about an address that's not being given. But that's the type of thing that I faced in grad school, so I'll be looking forward to the solution. Dan, thank you.
Old age. You'll be pleased to hear I don't have a slideshow for you. I'm going to let you use the theater of the mind. As the story goes, a group of French schoolboys, traveled to the English capital for a sightseeing tour. Asks by their guide what they would first like to see. They replied, "We want to see the home of Monsieur Sherlock Holmes on Baker Street." That anecdote exemplifies the reading public's perception of the importance of those lodgings to Sherlock Holmes' life as the world's only consulting detective. A number of Sherlockians have expressed a similar observation. Probably best noting that fact is Roy Abend. He has this to say, quote, "The rooms at 221B played an important part of the life and career of Sherlock Holmes. Not only the rooms for sleeping quarters for Holmes and Watson, but served as the center of the investigative universe for the master detective. These rooms enhanced the thinking process of Holmes. Away from 221B, Holmes was very uncomfortable and described in The Adventure of the Three Students by Watson as follows, quote, "My friend's temper had not improved since he had been deprived of his scrapbooks, his chemicals, his congenial surroundings at Baker Street, and his homely untidiness. He was an uncomfortable man. The above comments notwithstanding, there's a mystery surrounding Sherlock's lodgings. The mystery does not deal with the structure of 221B. Rather, it might be described as a sort of transcendental perplexity. Here we are confronted with a question of how can a space that is not a space be where it is not? Although Sherlock's biographer at times has been cited for his inconsistencies throughout the narratives, one assertion has remained rock solid. Sherlock's lodgings have always been at 221B Baker Street. However, it is also without question that no such address existed in 1881 when the events occurred out of which flowed Sherlock's A Study in Scarlet. The fact of there being no 221, let alone a number 221B address existing on Baker Street, remained in effect throughout Sherlock's residence at the imaginary location. The grim reality that Sherlock could not have lived at 221 has inspired Sherlockians of all stripes to seek locations for the inspiration, if there were one, of 221B. Since we as Sherlockians play the great game of Ronald Knox, and the guiding principle of that game being the writings in the canon are those of Watson and are based on fact, we must assume the physical presence of a dwelling described in the canon and identified as 221B Baker Street, even though the address did not exist. We are first introduced to the lodgings of Sherlock by Dr. Watson in A Study in Scarlet. Chapter 2 begins. We met the next day as Holmes had arranged and inspected the rooms at 221B, of which he had spoken at our meeting. They consisted of a couple of comfortable bedrooms and a single large, airy sitting room, cheerfully furnished and illuminated by two broad windows. So desirable in every way were the apartments that we began and concluded our dealings upon the spot, and we entered into possession at that time. From these beginnings, the world of Sherlock has been constructed, the Lord knows in how many 221B sitting rooms, consisting of various contents initially mentioned in the Musgrave ritual, including coal shovels jammed with cigars, Persian slippers stuffed with tobacco in their toe, unanswered correspondence transfixed by a jackknife into the center of a wooden mantel place, a hair-triggered pistol, and 100 boxer cartridges next to an armchair, various chemicals and criminal relics, a violin with its case and books resting nearby from a sofa to a table, papers in every corner of the room that had accumulated for months, manuscripts which were on no account to be moved, finally a commonplace book. Naturally, to all of this was added the patriotic VR done in bullet pocks on the wall, compliments of the boxer cartridges, and a hair-triggered pistol. One Sherlockian, with apparently more time on his hands with which he did not know what to do, counted 150 of these items appearing throughout the canon. And now venture to the London of the late 19th century to reflect upon what we know about Baker Street as it actually existed at that time. The Baker Street of 1881 was only 1/3 the length of its 20th century successor. Baker Street's east side ran from number 1 to number 42, those numbers running consecutively. Baker Street West ran from number 44 to number 85. There was no number 43. Therefore, the address of the lodgings of Sherlock could not have been 221. So the question, why did the author of the adventures fabricate the address of the dwelling? And secondly, when Watson referred to 221B Baker Street, was he alluding to an actual dwelling with a different address, or were the various descriptive facts involving the lodgings pure figments of his imagination? As to the first, why would Watson make up an address in the first place? There is a dearth of information to be found in the massive literatures surrounding Sherlock. But the two opinions I have located, Michael Harrison had this to say, quote, the street whose house was numbered from 1 to 85, 221B, must plainly be a fictitious one, adopted by Watson for the purpose of concealing the identity of the address that he shared with Sherlock. The only other comment I could find comes from Martin Dankin. Here, his take. It is clear that Watson disguised the number, possibly in deference to Holmes' dislike of publicity. With all due deference to Dankin's belief for concealing the address from the public, the tactic was a complete failure. Of the 60 published adventures, the applicant seeking assistance, whether it be an ordinary client or an agent of the government, can contact Sherlock at his residence in 45 of those 60 cases. Those persons running the gauntlet from the nearsighted typist to the exalted members of the nobility. In any event, both Sherlockians, Harris and Dankin, clearly infer that in their writings that Watson was indeed referring to an actual dwelling rather than one of his imagination. And this appears to be the majority view of those considering the issue. In passing interest would be the thoughts of Dr. Watson's literary agent on the subject, when or whether he might identify the house upon which 222B was based. He replied, quote, "But that is a point which for excellent reasons I will not decide." Since we can now return to the great game of roll and Knox, and with the knowledge of the physical pseudo-presence of a 221B, there are questions arising from Watson's comments about the residence. One very basic issue of significance is the B in the address. William Baring Gould believed the B indicates the rooms occupied by Holmes were on the upper floor of 221 Baker Street. That there is a contrary opinion expressed by some others. One of those is Leo Salvage. He points out, quote, "B indicates that a house has been added between the existing number and the following one in order not to have to change all the numbers above 221B. The new house would be a second 221 or 221B." Probably one of the most written about problems pertains to the bedrooms of the lodgings. Initially, the problem may be traced back to the idea we colonists have always had trouble remembering the first floor in London is a second floor in New York. As previously mentioned, Watson first described the rental as consisting of a couple of comfortable bedrooms and a single large sitting room. According to some students of the canon, this description, quote, "clearly implies that all rooms were part of an apartment on the British first floor." Yet, in The Adventure of the Speckled Band, Watson wakes to find Sherlock standing in his bedroom, and after dressing, accompanies Sherlock down to the sitting room. Insofar as the bedroom of Sherlock, Watson states on a number of occasions, the chamber is next to the one and connected to the first floor sitting room. However, in The Adventure of the Beryl Coronet, at one point, Holmes, leaving Watson in the sitting room, hurried to his chambers and was down again in a few minutes. To further stir the upstairs-downstairs saga, The Adventure of the Dying Detective, Watson refers to Mrs. Hudson's first floor flat. This could indicate landlady Hudson lived together with Holmes and Watson on the first floor of 221. This would have been an unthinkable event in the Victorian era. Since some have voiced a theory of another lodger occupying the premises with Holmes and Watson. If so, he would have occupied the ground floor, and the occurrence of such things as indoor pistol practice, melodious experiments, fights on the premises, and attempts to set fire of them would make him a candidate for the title, the patient resident. I had thought the number of steps on the ground floor to Holmes' rental, namely 16, was an established fact. Not so for Sherlockian C.N. Randall. He was troubled by that part of a study in Scarlet reading, quote, "There was a violent peal on the bell, and in a few seconds the fair-haired detective Tobias Gregson came up the stairs, 3 steps at a time, and burst into the sitting room. The problem presented, The staircase had 16 steps, and by no stretch of the imaginations was it equally divisible by 3. Thankfully, after much anguishment and thought, Sherlockian Rattle came to this conclusion, quote, Gregson started his run from the street, having stepped back after ringing the doorbell, and the first step he placed over the doorstep. Thereupon he put his foot on the second step of the notorious staircase, continued his ascent of problems, and finished on the landing, having 6 times passed over 3 steps. A question has also been raised as to whether Sherlock's lodgings contained a bathroom. J.A. Finch observed, quote, Dr. Watson, prim and proper Victorian that he was, never made mention of such a convenience. And why should he? A bathroom was not a novelty in the 90s. Our own Bob Katz has set forth an interesting theory involving the time-to-time ownership of 221B. He speculates, firstly, Mrs. Hudson was the owner of the lodgings when Sherlock and Watson first leased the premises. Secondly, from the start, the landlady was a kind, devoted, and courageous individual whose forbearance made it possible for Holmes to function efficiently. 3, yet, in A Scandal in Bohemia, Mrs. Turner, who Watson refers to as our, quote, our landlady, served the duo with a simple fare. 4, we may assume that Mrs. Turner purchased the premises from Mrs. Watson. 5, or Mrs. Hudson. 5, Mrs. Turner's patient wore thin with Sherlock's foul-smelling chemical experiments and indoor revolver practice. 6, and finally, an accord was reached and Sherlock purchased a 221B and persuades Mrs. Hudson to return as the housekeeper. In closing, it is notable to note how many individuals in the past are lived in, visited, or worked from a structure whose address was 221B Baker Street. Some of those personages include Dr. Gregory House of House MD, a TV series. In the Elementary television series, Holmes and Jane Watson stay in 221B when visiting London, away from Sherlock's New York home. Basil of Baker Street, of the book series The Great Mouse Detective, resided at 221B. My personal favorite, Fanny Fisher of Melbourne, Australia, in a book series by Carrie Greenwood, and the Australian television series Miss Fisher's Murder Mysteries, and finally, the Sherlock Holmes Museum of London, after all the years of requesting it, was given permission by the postal authorities to claim the address of 221B, even though the location is between 237 and 241 Baker Street. Therefore, we now have a fictional flat in a real city, which has been made a reality at a fictional address in a real city, near a real address in a fictional flat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dan. I particularly appreciated the fact that you were able to work into your talk divisibility by 3 of a prime number, which of course is impossible, but that played in very well. One of the things that Dan did for us, and I don't know why I'm getting all these flashbacks to my early professional training, there's something that mathematicians do called a proof by demonstration. And if you have read Euclid's Elements, he frequently uses a proof by demonstration. Proposition 1 of book 1 is to erect a equilateral triangle of arbitrary size. And he does that. The proof is simply he draws it and says, here it is. And so what Dan did is gave us a proof by demonstration that it is possible to give a presentation where every slide works exactly the way you wanted it to work. Our next speaker will be Lynn Stevens, a retired cable TV executive. She is an all-round Anglophile, with her love of Sherlock Holmes one major facet of her passion for all things British. Her articles on British arts and culture have been published in the Washington Post, Theatre Week, and Sherlock Holmes Mystery Magazine. Her first interview among many for Starlog magazine was with actor John Neville, who starred as Holmes in 1965's A Study of Terror. In 2019, Lynn served as Gassagine, the year-long leadership role of Watson's Tin Box of Ellicott City, one of the science societies that sponsors the Pratt Symposium. Lynn Stevens. Oh, and she's going to speak on dining out with Sherlock Holmes. I'm also supposed to include that. I just got so excited talking about Dan's proofs.
Thank you, Brent. I just realized that if we had continued on and that I had also been a Dan, that would make me Dan Stevens, which would be the star of Downton Abbey and Beauty and the Beast. What a glorious thing the continuing of the Dans could be. But alas, I am not a Dan, I am a Lynn. And I'm here to speak about dining out with Sherlock Holmes. And thank you for inviting me to speak today. Could I have the next slide, please? Now, when you think about Sherlock Holmes and eating meals away from 221B, this is probably not the first quote that comes to mind. But being an actor in the way Sherlock Holmes play acts requires far more skill than just putting on a putty nose and a shabby coat. Next slide, please. It means inhabiting a persona so thoroughly that Holmes can seamlessly integrate himself into whatever environment he needs to be in order to achieve his goals. Usually for Holmes, that's gaining information from someone. And it's difficult to gain information without trust. That's why the full term for a con man is confidence man. Next slide. And speaking of con men, hello, Escott, you sly dog. If Holmes sets out to gain someone's trust by impersonating a poor or working class person, then Holmes would obviously be a master in everything having to do with buying and eating the foods of a poor or working class person. Next slide. A low percentage of people below the middle classes could cook for themselves in their homes. Their meals were almost always on the go, and their objective was to get as tasty and filling meal as they could for the cheapest possible price. Throughout London, there were thousands of street vendors like this, serving dozens of cheap meals and drinks. I've listed some of the most common street foods available, and yes, cooked onions were one of the #1 grab and go, eat on the street Victorian foods. Vegetables and fruits in season were plentiful and usually cheap. Next slide. In addition, fish and shellfish were cooked in hundreds of London's eating houses, which were usually the proprietor's own house, with the front room transformed into a seating area with 4 to 6 booths. The term eating house has fallen out of common use, but the description paralleled the term public house, or a house where, instead of the owner serving food, the owner served alcoholic beverages. Today, Brits use the shortened version of that term, i.e. a pub. Where is Mr. Holmes in all this? If his companion asked him, "Let's do the tightener," that would mean, "Let's go to dinner." We can trust that Holmes knows how to order fried fish and tatties from a stall, calling out "Hayporth and pennorth," meaning a half-penny worth of chips, and a penny's worth or smallest portion of the fish. He would know to order his toast and butter, or is it butter, by asking for gravestones, or ask for the popular cold salted herring by asking for bloaters, which doesn't sound terribly appetizing to me. Most critically, through his profound knowledge of chemistry, his variable familiarity with botany, and his almost superhuman powers of observation, Holmes would know when not to eat what's on offer, either at a street stall or in an eating house. Unhealthy or downright poisonous additives were commonplace in the food of the poor and working class late Victorians. Copper found in bread and butter, copper sulfate in pickles, lead chromate in mustard, red lead in Gloucester cheese for that healthy red hue, Venetian lead in chocolate. And today it's hard to believe that people willingly asked for and ate Roxy, an umbrella term for any form of meat or from an animal that had dropped dead from disease, especially sheep. This could provide an unintentionally exciting meal that could include ringworm, salmonella, or tetanus. Yum. How did Holmes avoid all this? Holmes could work undercover for days at a time, Watson tells us. Holmes' ability to go long stretches without food when on a case would serve him well. If Holmes needed to, it would be child's play for Holmes to buy food for his informants and himself, make a quick inspection of what was served, and then duck out of eating it, if necessary, for his own safety. We know Holmes carried a meal while undercover on at least one occasion, but he couldn't be seen eating that pocketed sandwich of bread and meat and barrel coronet, because that would have been a right giveaway. Mrs. Hudson's bread would be lighter and more refined than most bread available to the working class, and meat, real meat, not fatty scraps or dollops of lard, would be consumed as a Sunday luxury at best. Next slide. That is not a picture of a dining room. Can you go back one? Yeah. Well, normally, if the photo had appeared, we would see a lovely picture of the front of Rule's Restaurant in London. Imagine a lovely host and a lovely entryway with the word "Rules" on a red awning, but we can use our imagination. It's turned into a radio play. Where would Holmes choose to eat when not undercover? From Watson's writings, we know that he visited Goldini's Italian restaurant, which would have been considered slumming it a little, since Italians, and hence Italian food, were then considered a hot-blooded, passionate race, not quite up to English snuff. Holmes probably ate at least once at Rule's, since it has been continually open since 1798. There, his gustatorial choices would have been very different from what was available to his working class characters. At least that shows up on the left, as you can see from this choice of menu items on the left there. The food choices weren't just hearty, they were very high in calories. These meals showed off the fact that you had wealth, but could lead, then as today, to heart disease, various cancers, and gout, which has been known for centuries as the disease of the rich man. Next slide. Okay, we got half of it there. We got the interior of Rule's with its plush and elegant decor and its emphasis on hearty classic English cooking. I can imagine that Rule's attracted Mycroft Holmes as a guest on the few times he varied from his routine. Perhaps the brothers dined there together, solving mysteries of the highest political importance. In the early 20th century, members of the Crawley family, Dan Stevens again, were seen eating here, which we saw in an episode of Downton Abbey. Next slide. Ah, a picture, yay. Because Watson mentions this place 2 times in his writings. Holmes' likely favorite restaurant was Simpson's in the Strand, not to be confused with Simpson's Tavern in the city, which sadly management closed permanently 5 days ago. This picture of Simpson's in the Strand is from 1903, so this is likely how Holmes and Watson knew it. Next slide. I think we're missing, no. We are missing a page. Yeah, yep, great. I've saved mentioning this traditional English entree for last, as it is considered the greatest and most traditionally English. Beef. That's quite a beef there. That is a cow. And it was cut and served tableside from massive wheeled trolleys in Holmes' day, as well as our own. Next slide. There we go. Simpson's in the Strand opened in 1828 as a chess club and coffee house. The restaurant claims that it established trolley service in order not to disturb the chess players concentrating on their games. In Holmes's time, chess aficionados were welcome to play in the room at the top of the building. Today, chess imagery is visible everywhere in the restaurant. So you can see there's a game board floor there in the entryway foyer, and you can also see there's a knight chess piece here on this table. And again, some of you may recall that members of Downton Abbey's Crawley family also ate at an episode that was set at Simpson's restaurant. Although it was refurbished in 2017, Simpson's has been closed since the start of the pandemic. Its website keeps saying it's going to reopen soon, but sadly, no date has been set. Next slide. Wow, we're missing a lot here. Anyway, I think Simpson's was Holmes' favorite place because it offered not only traditional English cooking, but also the pleasures of a game of chess. After the excitement of a case, Holmes could fill his stomach and then empty his mind with the simple challenge of two-dimensional chess. Last page. Well, we don't need the last page. I'd like to leave you with this thought to chew on. Given the pros and cons of the diets of the upper and lower classes, it is just possible that Holmes kept his lean form and robust constitution not only by avoiding the excesses of the upper class diet, but also by eating plenty of the fresh veggies, fruits, and leaner proteins he consumed when personifying members of the lower classes, while dodging toxins and broxy, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Len. Our next speaker this morning is going to be Art Taylor. He is the author of The Boy Detective and the Summer of '74 and Other Tales of Suspense. And brace yourself, this is being announced officially for the first time, the forthcoming collection entitled The Adventure of the Castle Thief and Other Expeditions and Indiscretions. And the title story of this new book, a series of thefts at an Irish castle, launched 2 characters into some Sherlockian investigations, or maybe towards some Watsonian missteps. Art is an associate professor at George Mason University, where he teaches the occasional course on Sherlock Holmes. And today he's going to speak on the Diogenes Club. It's all Greek to me.
Before we start, a couple of apologies. Number one, my presentation is about 12 minutes long. It does have 30 slides. So we're embarking on the adventure of the imperiled PowerPoint. I also want to apologize. Appreciate our ASL interpreter. There are a lot of Greek names ahead. apologies in that direction as well. I do want to point out that, it was presented as it's all Greek to me. It's all Greeks to me. I want to emphasize that S, which is underlined there. In advance of things that might not work out well ahead, I want to offer a little fun piece in advance. I don't know if anybody reads the New York Times online, but this morning when I got up and was scrolling through, I saw that the book review quiz bowl this week is How Well Do You Know Sherlock's London? A strong sense of place can deeply influence the story. This week's quiz explores real and still existing London locations and landmarks mentioned in the Sherlock Holmes novels and stories of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So there's something timely there in the New York Times. I have not yet taken the quiz because I was on my way here, but I encourage folks to take it soon. All right. Are you ready? Next slide. The Diogenes Club is first visited in the Greek Interpreter. It's referenced again in the Bruce Partington plans, both featuring Mycroft, who is pictured here on the side. Now, slide. It's good being here. It's a beautiful auditorium. I love Baltimore. Nope, that is way ahead. I'm going to patent that title, The Adventure of the Imperiled PowerPoint. I'm just going to write that story soon. No, not quite. That's all right. It's staying on there here, and where did you go? Where did you go down? There's a delay, possibly. That is the next slide that we're going to. Could you leave it up and just keep that on the side and go down? Does that work? We'll do that. I'm back. Did you miss me? The Diogenes Club is also mentioned not only in the stories, but also many interpretations afterwards, both film adaptations and works by other writers. I thought about it. This might actually have been a more interesting presentation than what I'm doing ahead, but I'm not going to talk about those adaptations today. We'll go to the next slide now. These are some of the passages from the Greek Interpreter, which is where we meet the Diogenes Club for the first time and at some length. I am not going to read all of the passages. I'm trusting that a lot of folks here have read the Greek Interpreter. If you have not, you should. I am going to focus on several details, so let's go to the next slide. For example, some of the key details. It is located in Pall Mall, near Mycroft's lodgings, right across from, and he was one of the founders. Its members, which are represented, as far as we know, mostly by Mycroft, are known for shyness, misanthropy, and little wish for the company of others. They are, in fact, and this is a direct quote, the most unsociable and unclubbable of men. In fact, no talking is permitted between them while in the main quarters of the club under any circumstances. Despite this, or maybe as a result of the silence, the club does have a very soothing atmosphere. In fact, it is quite nice. A large and luxurious room, comfortable chairs, and the latest periodicals. We'll do slide. At the time, in the mid-Victorian era, there were actually nearly 200 of these clubs. After 1870, another wave of new clubs, and Leslie Klinger in the new annotated Sherlock Holmes has two sources that talk about the clubs in the Pall Mall area in the 1890s, one citing 12 and one citing 14 clubs. Needless to say, Sherlockian scholars have tried to locate where is the actual club, or which club was the actual inspiration for the Diogenes Club. We'll go slide. Some of the approaches here are taking a different number of tacks. One is the descriptions I mentioned before. They actually go into the clubs themselves. Which one has, for example, a stranger's room? That is one of the things that is mentioned in the Greek Interpreter. Which clubs had that? That must be, therefore, a way to narrow which club is which. Some scholars have walked Pall Mall, looking at the relationship between possible lodgings and clubs, the distances walked. I've pointed out here, David Leal looks at the Survey of London, an 1892 issue of the Builder, the Pall Mall Gazette, Darwin's manuscripts at the Cambridge University, and more to try to pinpoint where the lodgings might be. Another point is membership requirements. What kind of club would a civil servant like Mycroft belong to? Would they avoid overtly political clubs? Would the Travelers Club accept a member who does not actually like to travel? And as far as accepting a member, Mycroft did found the club. How old are these clubs? I love the calculation down here. If Mycroft had founded the Travelers Club, he would have been 104 at the time of the Greek interpreter. Then there's the fact that Conan Doyle himself was a member of the Reform Club, which many people looking at biographical information suggest that would obviously be the one that he would base his. I'm taking a more direct route here than all this. The title of the story is The Greek Interpreter. So which real-life Pall Mall clubs have Greek names? Slide. Athenaeum, founded in 1830, and the New Athenaeum are the only clubs with Greek names. That seems kind of simplistic, but bear with me for a minute, because what can we learn by interpreting our own Greeks here? Slide. Athenaeum, needless to say, comes from Athena. Athena is associated with wisdom, crafts, reason, and civilized life, among other things. If you check the Athenaeum's website today, and this reflects both their historical membership and their current membership, they stress the intellectual interest of their members, particularly those who attain some distinction in science, engineering, literature, or the arts. We'll do another slide now. So, logically, and keep that word logically in mind, if Athenaeum is named after Athena, then the Diogenes Club would be named, okay, I'm belaboring the obvious a little bit, but slide. Do not tell my students about this, but I checked Wikipedia. And if we go to Wikipedia, this is the list of Diogenes that we have to work with. Needless to say, don't tell my students this either. The first hit is usually the right one, correct? So we'll go to the next slide. Diogenes the Cynic, Diogenes of Sinope there. This is a picture of him here. I hope the picture shows well there. He's sitting in what is a jar, a wine jar, and there are dogs on the side here. Diogenes the Cynic is the best known Diogenes. He's got to be the one that Conan Doyle was referencing. He's a Greek philosopher, a cynic, which actually comes from dog-like, and that's the dogs sitting here. Self-sufficiency is a key, check. But then we have rejection of luxury. I want to ponder on that a bit. Slide. Greek interpreter, through the glass paneling, Watson says, I caught a glimpse of a large and luxurious room in which a considerable number of men were sitting about and reading papers, each in his own little nook. I love that phrase, own little nook, because it does echo with that tub that Diogenes is sitting in. As I said, it's a clay wine pot, but that doesn't seem very luxurious to me. In fact, we're going to continue with that. One more slide. If we got the Diogenes Club, and this is the list I had before of the attributes, how well does it match up with what we know biographically and philosophically about Diogenes himself, at least this first one? We'll go to the slide. Key to Diogenes is rejection of luxury. He lived in the clay pot. There's a story about how he saw a boy drinking from his hands, and so Diogenes threw away the one bowl that he had to continue drinking from his hands. He was a beggar. He did beg for food. All of a sudden, we're marking out those comfortable chairs and the latest periodicals and the convenience and the soothing atmosphere in the large and luxurious room. Also, a disregard for organized society, considerably so. As you can see here, he ate in the marketplace despite the rules against eating. He scorned all social and political organizations, which would actually knock out the idea of clubs to begin with. We'll go to another slide. He was very outspoken. He used to disrupt lectures in the marketplace. In fact, if you were to read ahead, I'm not going to read all this, but you'll see he was not just outspoken, but actually obscene in many ways. So all of a sudden, even if this is going to match with misanthropy and no wish for the company of their fellows, it certainly goes against that silence that we're supposed to have at the Diogenes Club. So, slide. Are there any other Diogenes that we might want to look at here? I am not going to go through all of them. There are a couple, though, that I want to pay attention to. So if we can go to another slide. 3 in particular. Diogenes of Apollonia here was an ancient Greek philosopher. He believed air to be the one source of all being from which all other I'm going to stop there. From which all other substances were derived, and to be both divine and intelligent. Can you imagine what Sherlock would say to that? Slide. We're going to mark him off. So we're going to go ahead to some other Diogenes here. Diogenes of Babylon was a Stoic philosopher, and he was the head of the Stoic school in Athens. I want to pay attention to the Stoic school in Athens. Diogenes of Seleucia was an Epicurean philosopher. And those distinctions of Stoic and Epicurean lead me to the next slide, and bringing back our first Diogenes, who was known as Diogenes the Cynic. Okay, instead of focusing on biographical details, I want to focus on the philosophical differences specifically. Next slide. Diogenes the first is a Cynic. Diogenes of Babylon is a Stoic. Diogenes of Seleucia is an Epicurean. We'll go to the next slide. And I want to talk about what those mean. We may think of the word cynic in its modern meaning. This is from the dictionary. A person who believes that people are motivated purely by self-interest rather than acting for honorable or unselfish reasons. But the older philosophy of cynicism is marked by that rejection of ease and luxury, of wealth or power or fame. Stoicism has its own attitude toward ease and luxury, appreciative of luxury, certainly, but recognizing the vicissitudes of fortune and trying to stay strong even if you don't have that luxury. The philosophy is marked more fully by a focus on knowledge and perspective and reason and a sense of equanimity toward whatever life brings you. Now, Epicureanism, again, is what we think of today primarily in terms of food and drink, but its original attitude was one that valued pleasure more generally and tried to avoid pain more generally. This is not entirely hedonistic, I should point out, not pleasure, whatever the cost, but often with a sense of weighing things. How do I avoid what's troubling? How do I avoid what's painful? We'll skip again. I'm going to mark out. I'm sorry. I brought back that first Diogenes, and now I'm getting rid of him again. But I wanted to illustrate something about philosophy. Diogenes, the original that we talked about, just doesn't seem Mycroftian to me. Mycroft instead seems someone who values knowledge and reason and equanimity, and Mycroft clearly, his sedentary nature, is someone who appreciates pleasure and avoids pain. The Diogenes Club is a respite from the troubles of the world. I want to go a little further, though, in terms of trying to narrow down which of these it might be. Next slide. By talking about another figure. And something specific about Stoicism. Diogenes of Babylon was the head of the Stoic school in Athens, which was originally founded by Zeno of Cithium. It's actually another of the heads, and I recognize I have quite literally a head up here, that I want to focus on, a man named Chrysippus. Next. Chrysippus was a logician. He developed our ideas of logical thinking. He wrote actually 300 books on the subject of logic, which reading that had me, of course, think about Sherlock and his monographs on the ashes of cigarettes, cigars, and pipes, or ciphers, or on the human ear. This is a man who was an expert on logic. Now, one branch of logic, and we'll go to the next slide, particularly associated with Chrysippus, is propositional logic. This is based on the interrelationship between any number of if phrases. And now this list of interrelationships here may be a little confusing in the abstract. It's the first, then the second, but the first, therefore the second. It's the first, then the second, but not the second, therefore the first. So I'm going to give an example. Next slide. If it's raining, it is cloudy. It is not cloudy. It is not raining. That seems fairly simple. Let's go to the next slide. But I loved this as I was investigating from the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy. This is the example they use, and it actually illustrates 2 of those precepts in the abstract. Either cat fur or dog fur was found at the scene of the crime. If dog fur was found at the scene of the crime, Officer Thompson had an allergy attack. If cat fur was found at the scene of the crime, then McCavity is responsible for the crime. But Officer Thompson didn't have an allergy attack, and so, therefore, McCavity must be responsible for the crime. It seems almost Sherlockian in its beauty. Let's go to the next slide. My own logic here. If Athenaeum is from Athena, then Diogenes Club must be from Diogenes. If Mycroft is not dog-like, then it's not Diogenes the Cynic. If Epicureanism is predominant in the Diogenes Club, then Diogenes of Seleucia. But if Stoicism is predominant, then Diogenes of Babylon. If logic is more important than comfortable chairs, then Stoicism may be predominant over Epicureanism. And if the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy uses officers, allergies, cats, and dogs to explain propositional logic, then Victorian detectives are connected with the Stoic school of Athens through Chrysippus and Diogenes of Babylon. But if Chrysippus, then we have another bit of logic. Last slide. Why is it not the Chrysippus Club? Needless to say, the game, as they say, is still afoot.
Thank you for your patience with all of our AV issues. We are going to take a break right now, and we will be back, please, here in 15 minutes to continue with part 2. Thank you. Good afternoon. Welcome back. For those of you who are in attendance, we have, if you're interested in any of the local scions and more information, we have a sign-up sheet over here at the edge of the stage. So feel free, if you want more information, to sign up with your email address and you can find out more about our local scions. Our next speaker is Brent Morris. He retired in 2021 after 17 years as the editor of the Scottish Rite Journal, the largest circulation Freemasonry magazine in the world. He's a mathematician by training, as you may have guessed, and started his professional career as a cryptologist for 25 years at the National Security Agency, or no such agency. He taught at Duke, Johns Hopkins, and George Washington universities and has been invited to lecture at over 100 institutions. He's a past Gasogene, or past gas, of Watson's Tin Box of Ellicott City and a member of the 6 Napoleons of Baltimore. He worked his way through school as a performing magician, as if you might have guessed. Brent Morris.
There are at least as many reasons to love Sherlock Holmes as there are adventures in the canon. He always seemed to have the needed piece of data at hand, whether it is the significance of staining a tattooed fish's scales a delicate pink, or the way a dog cart throws up mud, or the distinctive clay and chalk mixtures from the region southwest of London. However obscure the information, Holmes always knows at least enough to take care of the case at hand. While his knowledge of literature, philosophy, and astronomy is nil, his knowledge of chemistry is profound. Accompanied by an immense knowledge of sensational literature. That sentence doesn't make any sense when I break it up like that. Hold on, the pages stuck together. His knowledge of chemistry is profound, accompanied by an immense knowledge of sensational literature. Okay, that reads a lot better. His goal was to selectively accumulate knowledge that would help him in his chosen profession of a consulting detective. He was an omnivorous reader with a strangely retentive memory for trifles. And it is the trifling operations of a British household that brings us to the Serpentine Muses. Miss Irene Adler, the retired prima donna of the Imperial Opera in Warsaw, resided at Bryony Lodge in Serpentine Avenue in St. John's Wood, London, a walk of a mile or so from Baker Street. Neighbors better known to modern readers are Madame Tussauds waxwork on Marylebone Road and the Abbey Road studios of Beatles fame. All of those are nearby neighbors of Serpentine Avenue. Holmes was drawn to this upscale neighborhood in his efforts to recover a compromising photograph of Miss Adler with his client, the King of Bohemia. Now, from the street, Holmes determined there was a Chubb lock on the door, a large, well-furnished sitting room with long windows on the right side, and a passage window that could be reached from the top of the coach house. This is useful, perhaps essential, intelligence about the exterior of Bryony Lodge, but there is no information about the residents, their habits, and more importantly for this case, the photograph. This is where Holmes' knowledge of British households becomes essential, more so than knowing that the earth revolves around the sun. Almost adjacent to Bryony Lodge is the carriage house, whose roof gives access to the passage window, and within which will be, not surprising, the carriage. I mean, that's why they call it the carriage house. But what about the horses for the carriages and those that tend them? They would be found in the nearby mews and a lane which runs down by one wall of the garden. Mews are sort of vertical duplexes for horses and their staff, with a gathering site for the residents. And My pages keep sticking together. Let's try that sentence again. Mews are a sort of vertical duplexes for houses and their staff, with the stables occupying the ground level and human quarters above. With living arrangements like this, there surely must have been great incentive to keep the lower quarters well cleaned. While there must have been disadvantages to living so close to horses, there was the enviable benefit of housing, secure housing that came with a job in the city. Not a bad deal. Now, the word mews is derived from the French verb muer, which means to molt, and it refers to the type of this type of building's original use, and that of caging hawks as they molted. Who knew? But if you are into falconry and as your birds are starting to molt, you put them in a mews. A large cage is their molting. Now, in 1548, the royal stables were built on the site of the Royal Hawk Mews. So they took the land that had been devoted to the birds, they repurposed it for horses. And sometime in the next century, the word was used to describe domestic stables in London. And now it can be used, now it can describe an architectural style based on stables below with human lodging above. So there's the evolution from the place for birds to molt to the place for the horses, and then if it's good enough for the royal family to keep their horses in the mews, then certainly we could keep our horses in the mews. Now, in addition to providing accommodation for horses and their staff, the row of adjacent houses created a natural gathering site for the residents, and it was this knowledge that Holmes sought. Among the obscure branches of knowledge in which Holmes excelled was disguise. After Holmes gathered all he could from exterior surveillance of Bryony Lodge, he then ambled to Serpentine Mews, dressed as a drunken-looking groom, ill-kempt and side-whiskered, with an inflated face and disreputable clothes. In this guise, he pitched in to help the ostlers. These are the stablemen, the horseymen. And Holmes was rewarded with 2 pence, a glass of half and half, 2 fills of shag tobacco, and as much information as he could desire about Miss Adler. And that was his reason for being there. He was dealing with people who on a daily professional basis took care of the family, and yet they were invisible. They were unseen because they were the staff, and they absorbed all the knowledge, and Holmes wanted to go to that fountain and sip from it long and slowly to get the information about Miss Adler and then eventually the photograph. Now, any person or thing leaving Bryony Lodge would be known to the groomsmen who prepared and drove the carriage. As, for example, they knew Miss Adler's routine of leaving every day from 5 to 7. They knew that Mr. Godfrey Norton called on her at least once a day and often twice. And they knew his residence, as they had driven him a dozen times from Serpentine Mews. If asked, they could probably name the most popular food served at Bryony. Certainly not carry-out. Papa John's didn't have a big presence at that time in London, but whatever was going to be cooked in the household of Bryony Mews would have come in with the carriage, and they would probably have carried it into the house. They probably knew the favorite desserts of Miss Adler and Mr. Norton. All of this from simply being present, and what are you going to do with all of that chocolate? Oh, haven't you heard? And now you find out what the special dish is being prepared. So this is all information that comes from being present, from being serving, and being invisible. The household operating information was critical to Holmes's locating the missing photograph and was part of his armory of knowledge. But it is this, but is that sort of, and was part of his armory of knowledge. It's neither literature, philosophy, nor astronomy, but is the sort of special information that gave him access, that gave him success in his work. I can imagine that Holmes was the librarian that I was told about in grad school. I remember being told very seriously, getting a PhD only means that you know where the library is. And it really means that you're good friends with the librarian. So for success with the type of obscure information that Holmes was famous with, he needed to know its various locations. And so in my mind, I see a desert with fountains hidden here and there, or sitting out here and there. And Holmes knew where they were, knew what you could sup from each of the fountains. And I like to think that he realized that the groundsmen of the Muse were the essential information, were the source of essential information for what he was looking at. There are probably dozens of similar fonts throughout the landscape where Holmes could have supped. But it was at the Serpentine Mews that he had his success. He found out what he needed to know. He set up that magnificently staged street scene. And I'm trying to find the right word to describe it. It simply wasn't a single event. It was a multi-act play, as you recall, where as Irene Adler drives up to her home, a fight breaks out. Someone with children comes over to see what's happening. There's someone who's a doctor, and the characters are all running about. And this has all been staged, and this is all part of the special information based upon what was going on at the Mews. And certainly, I would not have thought that the Mews, the stables and the residence behind the house was much of a place to go for information. But in fact, Holmes knew that it was. He knew he could find what he needed there. And so as he went through the landscape looking at his various fountains, whenever he was a little bit thirsty, he found that the Serpentine Mews met the needs that he had, which I find a pleasantly surprising use of obscure information that is always so satisfying. Thank you very much. And I have the advantage over the other speakers is that I don't have to do an awkward do-si-do on the stairs with the narrator, because the narrator is now ready to tell you about the next speaker. And the next speaker is going to be Karen Wilson. Karen Wilson is a Baltimore area philosophy teacher, church musician, Sherlockian, and grandma. The past Gassigine of Watson's Tin Box of Ellicott City. She is also a member of the Sherlockians of Baltimore, the 6 Napoleons of Baltimore, the Adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes, and the Baker Street Irregulars. She is co-editor of According to My Notes, which is a collection of essays on Sherlock Holmes and music published by BSI Press. And her talk today is going to be Like Some Fantastic Landscape in a Dream, Dartmoor and the Hound of the Baskervilles. Karen Wilson.
Well, my first 2 words have been rendered obsolete because Brent finished a little before noon. So good what's left of the morning. And we'll begin. For me and for many, Sherlock Holmes is most closely associated with London, that bustling metropolis where he lived with Dr. Watson at his famous address and competed with the good men of Scotland Yard in solving crime, of which there was no shortage. But the great detective's cases often took him away from his home turf, perhaps none more famously than The Hound of the Baskervilles, a Gothic mystery set in the wonderfully atmospheric Devonshire moors. It is my pleasure today to talk a little bit about that place, described in the text by Dr. Watson in breathless iambic pentameter as being like some fantastic landscape in a dream. That's Tempest-worthy, isn't it? Since the word moor will dominate what follows, let us begin by defining it. Moor, or moorland, generally refers to uncultivated hill land. Moorlands are both higher in elevation and higher in rainfall than surrounding regions, making for distinctive habitats, and they're found all over the world, including in North America, though we don't use that term. Now let's locate our specific moorland on a map. Here is the UK, home not only to Devonshire's moors, but to an estimated 10 to 15% of the world's moorland. Arthur Conan Doyle was far from the only 19th century author to be inspired by these wet, wild, windswept tracts of terrain. And one should not confuse the moors of the Hound of the Baskervilles, which with, say, the North Yorkshire moors that are the setting of Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. I've marked their rough location with a red circle about halfway up the coast of Great Britain there. But if you transfer your gaze to the lower left-hand corner of the island, you'll see another red circle, more or less delineating Dartmoor, which takes its name from the River Dart and is the moorland setting of the Baskerville tale. Uh-oh, this fellow's visage suggests that, with apologies, I shall not be sticking to the rules of the great game. In 1900, Arthur Conan Doyle spent 3 months volunteering in a South African field hospital during the Second Boer War. Traveling home on the Briton in July, the 41-year-old Doyle hit it off with shipmate Bertram Fisher Robinson, a 28-year-old journalist just making his reputation as a writer and editor. In March of 1901, the two men furthered their association by enjoying together a golfing weekend, during which Robinson recounted to Doyle an Old West country legend that sparked an idea for a story. They agreed that Doyle would write it, and in a letter sent that very weekend to his mother about the proposed collaboration, Doyle promised that the tale would be a real creeper. There was no mention of Sherlock Holmes yet. About a month later, the two men toured Dartmoor together. Wrote Fletcher Robinson later, "One of the most interesting weeks that I have ever spent was with Doyle on Dartmoor. He made the journey in my company shortly after I told him, and he had accepted from me, a plot which eventuated in The Hound of the Baskervilles. Dartmoor, the great wilderness of bog and rock that cuts Devonshire at this point, appealed to his imagination. He listened eagerly to my stories of ghost hounds, of the headless riders, and of the devils that lurk in the hollows, legend upon which I have been reared, for my home lay on the borders of the moor." During this excursion, Doyle again wrote enthusiastically to his mother about the book, by now professing to be halfway done with the story, and this time he did mention that boy from Baker Street. The story having evolved from its origins to a fully formed Holmes tale, Robinson's role in the creation was ultimately de-emphasized. Though he received a promised share of the royalties, plus inspired by credits, not to mention bragging rights, which he used, his name did not make it onto the book as co-author. Among the stories Fletcher Robinson surely told Doyle was the legend surrounding Richard Cabell, an actual 17th century Devonshire squire of Brook Hall, a real place seen here and more recently here, and clearly not the inspiration for the Baskerville Hall of story and films. Ooh, a little dark. Squire Cabell, an avid hunter, was rumored to have sold his soul to the devil. According to the legend, one night he beat his wife, believing her unfaithful, and then pursued her across the moor as she ran from him. He eventually caught and murdered her, only to be attacked in return by her faithful hound, who tore out his throat even as he stabbed it to death. On the night of his burial in 1677, a phantom pack of fire-breathing hounds is supposed to have come howling in from the moor to surround his tomb. After that, on the anniversary of the squire's death, it was said that he led the pack across the moor. Local villagers, in an attempt to keep both the squire buried and the hounds at bay, built a stone structure around his tomb that can still be seen today in the town of Buckfastleigh. So the basis of the book's backstory of Sir Hugo Baskerville's curse is clearly seen in the Cabell legend. And Doyle amps up the eerie Dartmoor atmosphere by placing two mysterious standing stones at the site of the grisly deaths. The illustrations to The Hound of the Baskervilles by Sidney Paget, whom Doyle requested for the assignment, give a real sense of both the isolating wideness of the land and of its eccentric punctuation by rock formations, both natural and man-made. One all too easily imagines the setting of The Hound of the Baskervilles in old movie shades of gray. And yet, listen to the description Dr. Watson gives of the train journey from London to Devonshire as he accompanies the Baskerville heir from London to parts southwest. In a very few hours, the brown earth had become ruddy. The brick had changed to granite, and red cows grazed in well-hedged fields where the lush grasses and more luxuriant vegetation spoke of a richer, if damper, climate. Young Baskerville stared eagerly out the window and cried aloud with delight as he recognized the familiar features of the Devon scenery. Color. Again, it is this that we imagine, but quite possibly this greener vista that met Sir Henry Baskerville's eyes as the travelers approached his ancestral home. Sir Henry is mesmerized by the sight of the moor. Dr. Watson, as my title quote suggests, is also arrested by the landscape. However, he quickly experiences a foreboding and melancholy to which the soon-to-be lovesick Henry is somewhat immune. Though loath to abandon the good doctor in that state, let us cut away and learn a little more about Dartmoor. As Doyle alludes to in the passage I just read, the scenery is laden with granite. In fact, the area contains the largest deposit of granite in Britain, so much that it causes measurable gravitational anomalies. The granite surface of the ground, which makes for acidic soil resistant to cultivation, is covered with a layer of peat, that is, decaying vegetation. Because of the high rainfall and the peat coverage which absorbs it, the moor is consistently wet. Areas where water accumulates become bogs, or synonymously, mires. Some of these can be dangerous to unsuspecting walkers. A quaker, for instance, is a water-filled hollow in the granite that's covered with enough thick green moss to invite one to step on it, only to have the surface shift or quake beneath one's feet. Sabine Baring-Gould, in his Book of Dartmoor from 1900, tells the story of a walker who finds a hat sitting on the surface of a mire. When he kicks it, he is surprised to hear the voice of its completely submerged wearer call out to him. The anecdote is intended to amuse, but while falling into a bog in broad daylight and living to tell about it is the sort of thing we associate with comic movie versions of Dr. Watson, in the book it is Sherlock Holmes who has to be extricated by his companions when he slips during a post-climactic visit to the moor in search of remaining clues. And it's no joke. The most famous of Dartmoor's bogs, Fox Tor Mire, is the supposed inspiration for the Hound of the Baskervilles' Great Grimpen Mire, swallower up of hapless ponies and deserving evildoers. Now we're going to look up from the bogs, and we'll see the other great natural feature for which Dartmoor is famed. It's tors, which are basically hills topped with outcrops of bedrock, usually in rounded boulder-like formations. The highest of these tors range from about 1,500 to, in one case, over 2,000 feet. Sidney Paget evocatively depicts first Dr. Watson, then a mysterious other man whose identity we will learn later, standing broodingly upon an outcrop of rock atop a tor. In other moments, convenient rock formations provide handy hiding spots for our heroes. And perhaps they could have made good use of these real-life ones as well. Actually, that one looks man-made. Let's move on from that one. That's appearing very dark there, but that's the hound tor, and it does sort of have an outline of a hound. That's not named after the Hound of the Baskervilles, but just the profile that it shows. So those are our bogs and tors. But there are also certain man-made features of Dartmoor that add to the atmosphere of the Hound of the Baskervilles, beginning with those aforementioned standing stones. Jack Stapleton introduces Watson and later Sir Henry to the locale, making sure to show them the site of Sir Hugo's legendary demise. The spot features two stones fancifully described by Watson as worn and sharpened at the upper end until they looked like huge corroding fangs of some monstrous beast. These standing stones, alternately called orthostats, liths, or menhir, are defined as large human-made upright stones, generally taller than a man and usually tapered at the top, that may be found alone as monoliths or in groupings. They are thought to date from the Bronze Age, which in Britain lasted from 2100 to 750 BCE. As to their original purpose, just like that of these Stone Age megaliths at Stonehenge, it remains a mystery. Though human sacrifice, time and date keeping, marking of territory, and providing mnemonic systems for oral cultures have all been suggested as the original purpose, Their latter-day purpose has come to be to stand as a reminder of the fact of our long-gone, enigmatic, remotest ancestors. They are thus the perfect feature for the Gothic landscape of a mystery tale. Relatedly, the moor is home to the remnants of ancient human homes, one of which, spoiler alert, Holmes makes his secret headquarters when he camps on the moor. Most of these prehistoric settlement remains date back to the early Bronze Age, some earlier, and in fact, Dartmoor contains the largest concentration of such Bronze Age remains in the United Kingdom. The climate of that long ago era is thought to have been warmer than today's. Much of the moorland would have been covered with trees until prehistoric settlers cleared the forests, mainly by burning, to create pasture and farmland. Centuries of such practices expanded the moors, helping to acidify the soil and to cause the accumulation of peat and ultimately bogs. After a few thousand years, circa 1000 BCE, a change of climate to something wetter and cooler drove these inhabitants down from the uplands. The acidic soil did away with most of their organic remains, though Dr. Mortimer did find a skull. However, granite is forever, and as noted, ruins of buildings and enclosures made of the local granite have survived. Indeed, the remains of 5,000 Bronze Age hut circles are estimated to exist on the moor. And so I find myself near the end of my time, still not having discussed that much later human contribution to the ominously atmospheric environment, Dartmoor Prison. Nevertheless, I want to stop here and end with an imaginary last word given by Dr. Watson, who confessed in his diary and letters to Holmes to letting the mood of his surroundings get to him. In my alternate version of events, however, I've imagined a letter in which Watson has powered through both the literal and metaphorical fog and has solved the case on his own. So let us get that ready.
Battery 5. Connected to Galaxy S20 at V5G.
Oh, brave new world. Hello, Sherlock. It's me, Watson, here in Dartmoor, where there's not sun. It is foggy, sometimes raining. Not that I, your faithful friend, would be complaining. Hope this finds you well and rested. Here's the update you requested. Still no sign of canine vicious, but a lot of folks are acting real suspicious. Seems the butler and his lady have been up to something shady, and Sir Charles had an alliance with a not quite divorced chick named Laura Lyons. And ignoring any peril, Henry's busy snogging Beryl. Brother Jack is quite annoyed. It's a subject fit for Dr. Sigmund Freud. On the moor, a beast not human growls. Meanwhile, not one but two men prowl. The puzzle of the century, or is it elementary? I can't solve this case without you, please. Come soon, 'cause I'm about to leave this whole mess in the hands of God. Or worse, I'll call our friend Lestrade. Wait, I've got it. I'm declaring convict Selden a red herring, and the Barrymores I'm clearing. Family loyalty like theirs is most endearing. Mrs. Lyons seems unlikely, and Miss Beryl doesn't strike me as a killer. Jack, it must be. Sherlock, you can stay in London if you trust me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Our next speaker is Alan Rettig, who is a retired film and video producer, director, and corporate communication manager. A Sherlockian since childhood, Alan is invested in the Baker Street Irregulars as the Red Lamp and is a longtime member of the Red Circle of Washington, where he serves as webmaster. He is also a member of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London and has spoken at numerous Sherlockian meetings and conferences. His topic is going to be, "And So Down Under, a Ballarat Odyssey."
Thank you. Just my luck, I have to follow a Karen Wilson song. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Glad to be here, and I'm really glad that the slides seem to be working, which is a real good thing. This little talk falls under the heading of Write What You Know, or in this case, Tell What You Know, because it's mostly about a personal adventure. But the story begins long before I was around, back in 1850, and the start of the Australian gold rush. The gold mined in Australia between 1850 and 1870 and exported where else, to Britain, paid off all the empire's foreign debts and laid the groundwork for her enormous commercial expansion in the latter half of the 19th century. Now, by the early 1860s, two men, drawn by gold fever to the mining towns of Ballarat, would set in motion the chain of events that concluded some 3 decades later with Sherlock Holmes solving the Boscombe Valley mystery. You'll recall this iconic Paget illustration of Holmes and Watson on the train bound for the valley, where the clash of John Turner and Charles McCarthy back in Ballarat held the key to solving the mystery of McCarthy's death. It was when I was in the 6th or 7th grade that my favorite uncle handed me the 2-volume Doubleday edition of the Complete Holmes. There's my Uncle George. He was a great guy. He was a professor of civil engineering. He was an amateur violinist and a damn good one. And he was, of course, a Sherlockian. He also got to run out some of the working drawings for the George Washington Bridge way back when. So he was quite a guy. But in any event, he said one day to me, he said, "Here, kiddo, you'll like this." And that's how I got hooked on The Great Detective. And we cannot let this slide go by or talk of the complete Sherlock Holmes Doubleday edition without talking about Christopher Morley's preface to that edition, in which he says, when he wanted to read about Arthur Conan Doyle, he came right here. He came right here to the Pratt. And it's there for all to see if you care to read it. It's a wonderful, wonderful preface if you haven't read it lately. Well, it was some 5 decades later that I got hooked on genealogy, and I fell just as hard for that as I did for Sherlock Holmes. Little did I know that when I started researching my mother's family, I'd find any number of connections between my ancestors and the exploits of Sherlock Holmes. I wrote about my Sherlockian family tree in last winter's Baker Street Journal, so you may have read about those touch points. But today I'll be expanding on just one of them, my family connection to the Australian Gold Rush, Ballarat, and Blackjack Turner. Back at the beginning of the gold fever in 1850, it was alluvial gold, gold found right on the surface in places like Ararat, Bendigo, Castlemaine, and Ballarat that triggered the frenzy in those precincts around Melbourne. The nuggets were there for the taking, sometimes by themselves, sometimes embedded in quartz. Smaller flakes were harvested with the time-tested tools of pans and sluice boxes. The allure was like nothing seen before in those parts, and prospectors came from everywhere, especially from southern China. And if you can see at the top of that building there, it's not the greatest resolution, but it does say Chinese restaurant, and there you can see, people being patrons of it. The great immigration of southern Chinese caused, as you might imagine, some little bit of racial issues, but the non-Indigenous population of the Melbourne area exploded from 29,000 in 1851 to 123,000 just 3 years later. But before long, the alluvial gold literally panned out, and it was necessary to dig for the rest. This was the time for serious engineering efforts and just plain hard work. And I absolutely love this image. How many guys does it take to dig a hole? One to supervise, one to read the paper, and one to dig. And of course, the tea kettle must be close at hand. But in fact, the digging was fierce and productive. By the early 1860s, about 200,000 pounds of gold a year, that's 100 tons, were extracted from the Melbourne goldfields. It was during this incredible boom time that the infamous John Turner, aka Black Jack of Ballarat, stopped working his own claim, formed an outlaw gang, and began a notorious second career as a highwayman. One day, Turner's gang held up a gold convoy driven by Charles McCarthy and killed at least 4 of the guards. But Turner spared McCarthy, an unexplained act of mercy that he would come to regret. 30 years later, in the Boscombe Valley, Turner would finish the job and kill McCarthy, who had himself become a villainous blackmailer. Of course, there were many twists and turns in the case, and it would take Sherlock Holmes to sort everything out and see that a form of rough justice was done. Well, my own genealogical journey started about 12 years ago, when a friend who was a seasoned family historian gave me a tutorial and set me off on my adventure. After much research and much travel, I wound up with a 30,000-word book tracing my mother's family. Like all family researchers, along the way I encountered my share of mysteries, some of them worthy of Holmes himself. One of them involved my second great-grandfather, William Mill. I knew that William was born in Cornwall, England in 1825. He was a tin miner and had 2 kids. But in 1856, he disappeared from the little Cornish town of Ellicott, leaving his wife and kids behind, and I couldn't figure out where he went. I assumed he'd come to America like most of my other ancestors, but I just couldn't track him down. Now, from the start, I had planted my family tree in cyberspace like most genealogists do. There you can see over on the left, there's me and family and my mom, Dorothy, my grandma, Emily, my great-grandma, Elizabeth Mill, and then over here, her father, William Mill, my second great-grandfather, and his wife, Jane Harris. Well, it wasn't long after my tree went online that I got an email from a most unexpected place. Margaret Joyce Mill MacDonald from Adelaide, Australia, wrote to tell me that she'd been following my tree online. What are the odds? Margaret introduced herself as a longtime volunteer with the South Australia Genealogy and Heraldry Society, aka Genealogy SA. And she wanted me to know that I'd been looking in the wrong place for William Mill. He hadn't come to America. Instead, he boarded the clipper Queen of the Seas and 5 months later arrived at Melbourne's Port Phillip Bay. He worked in Australia for the rest of his life as a miner and a mine manager. Looking at her own tree and mine, Margaret had quickly determined that she and I are second cousins once removed. And she sent me her full dossier on William Mill. And it had that photo in it, not much of a photo, but what are you going to do? Well, as shocking as it was to hear from Margaret, it was positively stunning to find that for his first decade in Australia, William had labored in the gold mines of Ballarat. Wow, the news literally made me shiver. Now, we all know that Sherlockian chronologists argue endlessly about the dates of the adventures, a pastime that shows no sign of slowing down. Baring Gould says that the Boscombe Valley mystery took place on the 8th and 9th of June, 1889. Others disagree. But remember, Black Jack Turner ambushed Charles McCarthy and liberated his gold decades earlier. Happily for me, Turner began his confession with these words, dutifully recorded by Watson. It was in the early 60s at the diggings. Simple arithmetic. My second great-grandfather, William Mill, arrived at Ballarat in 1857 and spent at least a decade there. Clearly, he was there for all of the early 60s. Is it reasonable to imagine that William knew John Turner or Charles McCarthy? Certainly it is. And if he didn't know Turner, he surely knew of him, for Black Jack's gang was utterly notorious. And so it came to pass that I added detail to my own family tree and an entire branch to my Sherlockian family tree. But the adventure didn't end there. Throughout our long string of correspondence, my newfound cousin Margaret virtually insisted that Terry and I come to Australia and pay a visit. She didn't have to twist our arms too hard. Unlike Grandpa William, we decided not to spend 140 days on a clipper ship. We chose another ship with a queen in her name that was more appropriate to the adventure. Cunard's Queen Victoria, what else? We crossed from California to Sydney, and after a visit there, flew to Melbourne and made our way to Ballarat. 1910 marked the last serious gold rush in those Victoria goldfields, and today, Ballarat caters largely to the tourist trade. Even so, the surge in gold prices just after the beginning of this century rekindled the fever in both Bendigo and Ballarat, where some commercial mining is still to be found. The Sovereign Hill mine is still the center of business in Ballarat. A journey to the depths for us was a highlight. And we were lucky to be on hand for a pour, as gold bar was created for export. There's no doubt about it, in the mining towns surrounding Melbourne, gold is still a driving force. Now, we didn't go off prospecting on our own, but it's clear from this advisory that seekers of fortune, whether casual or serious, are still looking to strike it rich. I don't know if you can read it, but I'll read it for you. Always be wary when you are walking when gold detecting in the bush, as there are lots of unexpected open mine shafts throughout the area. You will also encounter uneven ground, slippery clay in wet weather, and there is always the prospect of encountering snakes in summer. Always let someone know where you are going before heading out bush. And I might add, make sure your will is up to date. In the center of town, the Ballarat Times newspaper is still in business and still uses its massive letterpress. In addition to the paper, the Times prints posters to order, and I had one made up to commemorate my Sherlockian connection. When he handed it to me, the printer said, "Here you are, Mr. Turner." "I think it looks just grand," he said. Well, I agreed that it does look grand, but I had to tell him that I'm not Mr. Turner. When I told him of the Boscombe Valley mystery, he said he'd get it from the library and read it over his evening tea. And I still take pleasure that the bottom of the poster reads, "Printed by Ballarat Times, Sovereign Hill Gold Mining Township, Ballarat." And as I'm sure you know, in the world of Sherlock Holmes, sometimes things have their own way of going viral. I'm sure that some of you know Gene Upton and Roger Johnson, the London Holmesians who, among many other things, are in charge of curating the Sherlock Holmes sitting room in the pub of the same name at number 10 Northumberland Street there in London. The sitting room is a marvelous place that had its beginnings as part of the 1952 Festival of Britain celebration, which in a real way became the genesis of the Sherlock Holmes Society of London. On a visit to London just before COVID, I gave a copy of the poster to Roger and Jean. Not long after, they sent me this photo of the bulletin board in that fabled room, half a world away from Ballarat. And if any of you would like a copy of the poster, please take my card and send me a note, and I will reply with a high-res PDF that you can easily print. Well, we had one more stop to make on our Australian odyssey. Another quick flight, and we were in Adelaide, where we spent some quality time with my newfound cousin Margaret and her husband Dean. What do you think? Is there a family resemblance? I don't know. In any case, I'll always be in Margaret's debt for finding my grandpa William Mill and for jump-starting my Ballarat odyssey. "Farewell then," said Black Jack to Holmes and Watson. And with that, I come full circle on my Australian adventure. Thank you for letting me share it with you.
Our last speaker is going to be Andy Solberg. If you know Andy, what he has done for his introduction is a very Solbergian thing. And that is, he sent in nothing, and I have a note here, make up something, exclamation point. So all I have to say, Andy, is if you're not satisfied with what I made up, you want to be sure to write your own next time. Andy Solberg, I'm proud to count him as a friend. He is a Sherlockian scholar of renown. He belongs to the adventuresses of Sherlock Holmes, to the Baker Street Irregulars, and to dozens of other organizations. His scholarship is appreciated and in demand, and when you hear him speak, you realize that there is a certain poetic quality to his writing. He created and manages the Sherlock Holmes essay contest in the Howard County School District in Maryland. And every year, I think it's the sixth graders, I apologize if it's the seventh graders, the middle schoolers of that grade are encouraged to write an essay on the speckled band. It's graded by the teachers, and then Watson's Tin Box of Ellicott City pays for the prize that's given to the winners, and Andy is the father and supervisor and head man of that. He's kind, he's generous, and he's thoughtful. Let me give you one example of that. Over the 20 years that I've been associated with Watson's Tin Box, we've had the misfortune of being kicked out of a restaurant. Well, kicked out is too strong. They've just said they won't be able to serve us anymore. You can decide for yourself why. And then we go through, and if you've done this, you know how discombobulating it is trying to find a new restaurant that meets your needs. Andy has always had one concern in this, and that is we never go any place too expensive to prevent anyone who wants to attend from attending and participating. Andy's a hell of a nice guy. If you don't like this, write your own damn introduction next year. Okay, Andy's going to speak on Cheesemans and Sussex.
Good afternoon, everybody. I was browsing a list of curious places, each with their own individual graces, when my eyes fell upon a very curious name, and my curiosity began to inflame. In the short story, The Sussex Vampire, Holmes traveled to the little shire of Lamberley, Sussex, where things were awry. But it was Cheeseman's that caught my eye. Robert Ferguson was married to a Peruvian woman whom he loved, but who, though she was a good mother, she seemed a wreck and appeared to be biting her baby's neck. Ferguson sought out Holmes's assistance to determine the cause of this inconsistence. Cheeseman's, Lamberley, Sussex, was the address. So Holmes and Watson set out to see how things coalesce. It turns out that Cheeseman's was the name of a house in which Ferguson lived with his Peruvian spouse. For Watson explained that old houses in that borough were named after the men who built them centuries ago. So evidently, either a person named Cheeseman developed the house and also the grounds that enveloped, or a seller of cheese had done the same, and centuries later it still bears the name. I think that it is the former because the name still persists. Today in Sussex, there are people named Cheeseman exist. Though, of course, their name is probably originated from a man who sold cheese, and so it was created. By the way, there is also a cheeseman, a large seller of cheese in business in Sussex, if you believe. But it was only founded in 1995, so any Sherlockian interest is purely contrived. But this case happened in 1896, so a cheeseman that year would have to exist. So then I turned to resources online, and I found Kelly's Directory of Sussex from 1899. And I searched for all the cheesemen, and what did it show? 19 people whose last name was Cheeseman that long ago, but nothing noting such an address. And nothing in Amberley, I have to confess. What if Watson actually used Robert Ferguson's real name, I mused. So I searched Kelly's for his name, and I didn't find one that was the same. There were Arthur and Alex and others, sure, but no Robert that I could procure. But I did find a business that made me see, what if it was a coal merchant instead of tea? A Frederick Ferguson of Godsmark and Ferguson existed in Hayward's Heath. A firm of coal merchants was listed. But while I could find the business address, I could not find where Frederick went home to rest. I searched for other terms from the story too, like tea, mincing, muirhead, but found not a clue. And so in the end, I finally relented and stuck to the facts that Watson presented. Now, Sussex is in the south of London, the southeastern outpost. It's the county that is on the English Channel's coast. Sussex figures in 5 of the stories, and of course, Holmes retired there, of which you'll hear more. Before reaching Cheeseman's, Watson says, interestingly, that they left their bags at the Checkers in Lamberley. Now, there is no such town in the area called Lamberley, but it's a thin disguise for the real town there named Amberley. There was no Checkers in Amberley. According to the Kelly's 1899 directory, but there was a Houghton Bridge Inn, so perhaps they left their bags therein. However, today, the inn is only a pub with no accommodations, only the grub. And that also may have been true in the past, as I could find no history of it, alas. For Watson put the word Checkers in quotes, and nobody knows what that denotes. It may have been used as just a term for an inn, or they may have stayed at a Checkers. Tune in. In Britain, Checkers is a popular name for pubs, hotels, and inns, and no one was really sure where the name begins. I have found several explanations in various online publications. One says it's derived from an Old English tree that's got bark like a checkerboard that was used to play drafts. And the tree has berries, and you're right if you think that the berries had often been brewed into drink. Another says that the Egyptian god Osiris was represented by a checkerboard, and that it was used as a sign where one could drink beer, and that the ancient Romans adopted it and brought it there. Still another says William the Conqueror took and wrote in the Doomsday Book that taxes should be paid throughout the land, and the exchequer offices then began. A checkerboard cloth was used to count the landowner's taxed amount. And to help ease the pain, the offices became pubs and checkers began. But by 1653, John Taylor, a poet of note, who had traveled from the town Petworth to Staining, wrote, August the 18th, 12 long miles to Staining. I rode, and nothing there saw worth kenning. But that mine host was a jovial wight, my hostess, fair and fat, a goodly sight. The sign, the checker, 18 pence to pay. My mare eat mortal meat, good oats and hay. And several checkers can trace their age to the 1600s history page, including some, luckily, in the area around Amberley. Now, Watson said that it was south of Horsham, and Amberley fits that proportion. Also south of Horsham, there's still a Checkers and Staining, the town about which John Taylor was explaining. Another of my choices in Pulborough lay, because if you Google today, Checkers Amberley, you will find the one in Pulborough, but do the facts align? The description says that it's an historic hotel with features dating back to 1548 as well, but it would be a bit less than an hour's drive to a house named Cheeseman's in Amberley from the boarding house. But alas, the Kelly's directory finds 7 Checkers in Sussex in 1899, but not one in Amberley or Pulborough. So, without a doubt, we have to rule that one out. As there is no Checkers in Amberley that year, we should find another that is near. And I think that Staining actually fits the bill. It's the closest to both London and Amberley still. Staining is about a 10-mile drive to Amberley, so they would arrive at Cheeseman's in about an hour when one was riding in a carriage under horsepower. While the Kellys said that the one in Staining was a public house, not an inn, and not all pubs offered lodging therein, but if you look up inns on Kelly's list, it directs you to pubs, so similarities exist. And today's Checkers and Staining's website says it provided accommodation in the 19th century without equivocation. And you'll be happy to know that some additional authentication, as the inn is in the exact same location. So while I could not find where Cheeseman's is located, and the location of that can still be debated, I do believe that I have recorded the very inn in which Holmes and Watson had boarded. On to retirement. Now, you're all Sherlockians, so I'll assume that you know that Holmes retired in 1903 in order to go to a farm in the Sussex Downs, 5 miles from Eastbourne town. In the preface to his last bow, Dr. Watson told us how Holmes had retired to his agriculture and bees, rejecting all cases for princely fees. Many Sherlockians have tried to decode the mystery of the location of Holmes's abode. Of course, all of their deduced tracks must align with the published facts. We know from the preface of Holmes's location, 5 miles from Eastbourne and his avocation, and in the Lion's Mane, Holmes added the embellishment that he lived half a mile from the Gables, Harold Stackhurst's educational establishment. He also said that his villa was on the southern slope of the Downs, and that had a great view of the channel in his rundown, and that the coastline at that point is entirely chalk cliffs with a single long, tortuous, steep path on which one could easily slip. At the bottom lie pebbles and shingles, even when the tide is full. Here and there were hollows, which make splendid pools. This admirable beach extends for some miles in girth, save only at the little cove and village of Fulworth. Also, in the cliffs, there were caves facing east. We know that because in the afternoon, the sun's lighting them ceased. So those are the facts that where dwelt, and now let's see where Holmes may have dwelt. First, you should know that Holmes changed the names of people and places in the Lion's Mane. There was no Fulworth, Stackhurst, or Murdoch that I could see when I checked Kelly's 1915 directory. The Brits have studied this pretty carefully, including where there was a farm that was protected by bees. Some have walked the downs so they could see the locations and fit the facts to a T. Remember, Holmes lived 5 miles from Eastbourne, but it could be hither or it could be yon. They have written that it was to the west that seemed to fit the published facts best. A common preference is for Burling Gap, 5 miles west of Eastbourne on the map. It fits all the requirements except for one. The caves do get the afternoon sun. The east-facing caves are significantly too close to Eastbourne or too far to engross our confidence that either's the right place where Sherlock Holmes solved the lion's main case. I tend to agree that he lived near a place called Burling Gap, as the distance is clear. But I have found another fact that led me to keep these conclusions intact. From Burling Gap, there's a mile between it and a northern village of East Dean. In finding East Dean, I think we have unearthed the fictional village of Fulworth. Burling Gap itself is not a village per se. It's a location on the cliffs, I should convey. In fact, Kelly's listed it as part of East Dean so long ago in 1915. Now, another Brit previously wrote that East Dean was too far from the coast. But Holmes may have lived in the East Dean surroundings closer to the coast, or so I'm propounding. The distance, again, is only a mile. So if Holmes farm was halfway, that would be worthwhile. It easily could meet the distance requirements of our story regarding his retirement. But there are two other facts I want to relate. One regards a school that Holmes commemorates. In the story, he refers to it as the Gables, but I doubt it, as he changed the name in this fable. But there was a school in East Dean called Gilbert Working Men's Institution, I can glean from the Kelly's 1915 directory. As Holmes would say, it's elementary. Also in Kelly's, I found in East Dean the following charm. A Charles Fairs, who was farm bailiff to S.H. Weston, Esquire, Manor Farm. Might the S.H. have been the initials for a retired detective, and Weston to have been an alias, though not that effective? Further, the Brits have found this remarkable tease that long ago, Burling Manor Farm kept bees. I think that the facts are falling into place and that we may have actually solved this case. Thank you. We're going to go in from down there.
Well, this brings us to the traditional closing of the Pratt Symposium, and that is the Inquisition. Carla is passing out cards, and if you need a writing implement, she has a pen for you. We're going to give you a series of questions. It'll be graded on the honor system, and you will need to answer each question. We'll give you a little time to do that, and then we'll follow up and we'll take a score, do a tally, and then if we need to, we will have additional questions. We're not willing to stop until we get a winner. All right, we almost have them passed out. Yes, good question. Is there a prize? Yes, we have some a selection of books for the winners, and Carla is our prize mistress, I guess, prize master, prize holder. She's got them all in her bag. Okay, we'll start out with the first question. I think almost everyone has a card, and you'll have it in time to put it down. Oh, not yet. Okay, no, still got a few more to go.
That's right. I know two of the answers.
While we're waiting, Baltimore has an old and well-respected Sherlockian society called the 64. And if you're not on the mailing list and you would like to, there is a sign-up sheet on the stage, but also you can see.
I just got the thumbs up, ladies and gentlemen. Question 1. Name the Sherlockian who was the originator of the great game. Name the Sherlockian who was the originator of the great game. What is the term, question 2, what is the term dating back to Old English meaning a craggy outcrop of rock on the summit of a hill, and also used to refer to the hill itself? What is the term dating back to Old English meaning a craggy outcrop of rock on the summit of a hill, and also used to refer to the hill itself? Question 3. What was Black Jack of Ballarat's real name? What was Black Jack of Ballarat's real name? Question 4. The pub Alpha Inn in the Blue Carbuncle is in reality most likely the pub that remains, is most likely what pub that remains today? The pub in Alpha Inn in the Blue Carbuncle is in reality most likely what pub that remains today? Question 5. What game was played in Holmes's favorite restaurant? What game was played in Holmes's favorite restaurant? Question 6. From whom did Holmes get information at the Serpentine Mews? From whom did Holmes get information at the Serpentine Mews? Question 7. Which of the following philosophical schools is not associated with one of the 3 Diogenes discussed today? Cynicism, Epicureanism, skepticism, or Stoicism? Which of the following philosophical schools is not associated with one of the 3 Diogenes discussed today? Cynicism, Epicureanism, skepticism, or Stoicism? And the final, question 8, around what year did the Ballarat Gold Rush begin? Around what year did the Ballarat Gold Rush begin? Would anyone like for me to repeat any of those questions? There were 8 of them. Yes, ma'am. Could you please repeat question 3? Question 3. What was Black Jack of Ballarat's real name? Yes, sir. I'd be happy to repeat 1 and 2. Excuse me. Question 1. Name the Sherlockian who was the originator of the great game. Name the Sherlockian who was the originator of the great game. Question 2. What is the term dating back to Old English meaning a craggy outcrop of rock on the summit of a hill, and is also used to refer to the hill itself? What is the term dating back to Old English meaning a craggy outcrop of rock on the summit of a hill, and also used to refer to the hill itself? Any other repeats? 4. Yes, sir. 4. Oh, number 4. The pub Alpha Inn in the Blue Carbuncle is in reality most likely what pub that remains today? The pub Alpha Inn in the Blue Carbuncle is in reality most likely what pub that remains today? You ready for the answers? Question 1. Ronald Knox was the originator of the great game. Question 2. The word tor, T-O-R, means a craggy outcrop of rock or can refer to the hill itself. Question 3. John Turner was the real name of Black Jack of Ballarat. Question 4. The Museum Tavern is most likely the Alpha Inn. Or no, the Alpha Inn is most likely the Museum Tavern. Chess is the game that was played at Simpson's in the Strand, Holmes's favorite restaurant. Holmes got his information at the Serpentine Mews from the horsey men or the groomsmen or the ostlers who gathered in the mews. The philosophical school not associated with one of the three Diogenes discussed today is skepticism. And finally, the Ballarat gold rush began around 1850. 1850, 1850, 1850. So please tally up your score, the total of 8 points. Do we have anyone who has achieved 8 points? 7 points. We've got a 7-pointer here. Six points. One. We've got one 6-pointer over here, Carla, the gentleman. 5. 1, 2, 3 5s. Okay, this is getting exciting. I can feel the tension mounting in the air. And so only the 3 people with the score of 5 are going to participate in this. So the pressure is on them. Round 2. Question 1. Name 3 known visitors to the British Museum. Name 3 known visitors to the British Museum. Number 2. State the number of actual buildings on... State the number of actual buildings on Baker Street in Sherlock's day. State the number of actual buildings on Baker Street in Sherlock's day. 3. What is the oldest currently operating restaurant in London? The oldest currently operating restaurant in London. And finally, question 4. Who told Arthur Conan Doyle the legend of the wicked Dartmoor squire that would become the basis for the Baskerville curse and the Hound of the Baskervilles? Who told Arthur Conan Doyle the legend of the wicked Dartmoor squire that would become the basis for the Baskerville curse and the Hound of the Baskervilles? Okay, do any of those 3 need a question repeated? Here come the answers to round questions in round 2. Answer 1. Known visitors to the British Museum are Karl Marx, Henry Baker, and Sherlock Holmes. The number of actual buildings on Baker Street in Sherlock's day was 84. Baker Street's west side numbers ran consecutively from 1 to 42. The east side numbers ran consecutively from 44 to 85. There was no number 43. That's a trick question. What is the oldest currently operating restaurant in London is Rules. And Bertram Fletcher Robinson, or just Robinson, was the one who told Arthur Conan Doyle the legend of the wicked, about the wicked Dartmoor squire. Who has all 4 answers correct? Who has 3 correct? Oh gosh, 2 correct. We've got 2 in the back, a winner. Very good. Carla, the custodian of the prizes. And now, before we close, we're going to have a few words from Carla Coop. As she's coming to the stage, I might point out, and you know this in almost any activity you've been involved in, some people may be chosen for their sexy good looks. Other people are chosen because they do the hard work. The person who did the hard work is Carla Coop. Herding the cats, getting all the information together, she's the one that made this meeting a success. And so, Carla, with that, the stage is yours.
For all the sexy good looks, however, we have to look to Brent. I would like to thank the staff of the Pratt Library, especially Cleve Corner, Genevieve Purchase, JP Santana, Sophia Nolowi, Darcel Graham, Liz Sunderman, our wonderful interpreters, for their help in hosting the 43rd Saturday with Sherlock Holmes. I'd also like to thank the sponsoring scions, the 6 Napoleons of Baltimore, the Sherlockians of Baltimore, and Watson's Tin Box of Ellicott City. Of course, we wouldn't have had an event without our speakers, so thanks and praise to all of you for first saying yes when I asked you to participate, and second, for showing up and providing such interesting and entertaining presentations. Thank you, Brent, for your skill as an MC. And thank you all for showing up, both in person and virtually. And I hope you enjoyed spending a Saturday with Sherlock Holmes. Thanks. For those of you who are waiting for parking validation, I hope they are outside. I do not know. I'm going to go look and find out. We will get it resolved before you have to leave.